Rand at that conference, and not one of them would shake hands with Dan. Not one would sit near him. They treated him as a traitor. And whether they meant a traitor to his country or a traitor to his organization, it's hard to know.
I was Typhoid Mary. I was a leper with a bell around my neck. I've come to realize the fear of being cut out from the group of people you respect and whose respect you want and normally expect. That keeps people participating in anything, no matter how terrible.
Whatever his intentions may have been, in your opinion, did Daniel Ellsberg betray his country?
I would put it another way. Daniel Ellsberg, whatever his intentions, gave aid and comfort to the enemy. And under those circumstances, that is inexcusable. After all, he is putting himself above the President of the United States, above the Congress, above our whole system of government, when he says, in effect, that he would determine what should be made public.
I think that there is probably some good justification for the strong feelings Nixon had. He would make a decision in the National Security Council and the next day read it on the front page of the New York Times or some other newspaper. This makes it virtually impossible to govern.
Just because some guy's going to be a martyr, we can't be in a position of allowing the fellow to get away with this kind of wholesale thievery, or otherwise it's going to happen all over the government. I just say that we've got to keep our eye on the main ball. The main ball's Ellsberg. We got to get this son of a bitch.
The leak of the Pentagon Papers changed the Nixon White House. It really is what some of us have called the beginning of the dark period. I mean, it was rough and tumble before, but it got down and dirty. So it's really a defining event for the Nixon presidency. And this is when Eagle Krogh, Bud Krogh, was selected to head up the so-called Plumbers Unit.
I was summoned to the Oval Office by the president. John Ehrlichman and I met with him. There was some suspicion that Dr. Ellsberg had access to the more recent war plans that had been developed by the Nixon administration and would be able to release those documents. I came from that meeting feeling very strongly that I was dealing with a national security crisis and I was to take any means necessary to respond to it.
The difficulty is all the good lawyers always say, well, we've got to win the court case, screw the court case, but convict the son of a bitch in the press. That's the way it's done.
The president had decided to set up a special investigations unit in the White House staff.
You've got to get a better team.
There's one guy on the outside. He's hard as nails. His name is Howard Hunt.
Or he can do it, and I'll direct it myself. And I play it gloves off. Now, goddamn it, get it going on.
Did Daniel Ellsberg work alone? Was he working with some other people? Was it part of a conspiracy? And it was in that context that a proposal was made by E. Howard Hunt to get information that could be used to discredit Dr. Ellsberg. A covert operation ought to be undertaken to examine all of the files still held by Dr. Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Dr. Lewis Fielding. This went to John Ehrlichman. Underneath that proposal were two lines, approve of the line, disapprove of the line. He wrote his large E after approve, and then put in, under your assurance, it is not traceable.
The FBI came one day and said, I'm afraid we have a subpoena here for you to testify today at the grand jury. My father was very upset. He somehow thought that there was something more that my mother could do to prevent this somehow, if she had better legal advice or whatever her attitude was. So you're the one who got him into this. Of course, he's gonna just tell the truth. And my father said, well, of course, you've got to just tell the truth. My personal involvement in the whole thing, the people I knew about, and the copying of the Pentagon Papers, that became the focus of the indictment.
I have a statement. I have a prepared statement that I'd like to read.
Well, I said to myself that I would not testify against him.
You put my cigarette out.
Because after all, to begin with, I had urged him to do it.
The Attorney General offers me the alternative of collaborating with him in his attempt to prosecute Daniel Ellsberg by testifying in secret before a grand jury. For me, that is no choice.
He was immediately put in custody for contempt of court. He offended the prosecutorial team by refusing to cooperate in any way in the grand jury. If Tony had testified, he would have been out scot-free.
The first thing that came to my mind was Gandhi's dictum, you should not cooperate with evil.
The Pentagon Papers drama changed abruptly into the Pentagon Papers media freakout and cameraman's farce as the documents arrived at the Senate.
I think Dan was disappointed in that he may have expected too much from the publication of the papers. He may have expected that the publication of the papers would create a greater sensation than it did. Of course, it created a sensation.
Where is Mr. Ellsberg? I hope he's in the jail.
But I think he was disappointed in the fact that the substance of the papers, the content of the papers, did not seem to be absorbed by the public.
I gave up my job, my career, my clearance, and I staked my freedom on a gamble. If the American people knew the truth about how they had been lied to, about the myths that had led them to endorse this butchery for 25 years, that they would choose against it. And the risk that you take when you do that is that you'll learn something ultimately about your fellow citizens that you won't like to hear. And that is that they hear it, they learn from it, they understand it, and they proceed to ignore it.
I still think we ought to take the lights off now. I think to let drown people get drowned out about 200,000 people. Well, no, I'd rather use a nuclear bomb because that's right. That I think would just create too much. A nuclear bomb? Never mind. I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake.
I remember speaking about a year ago and expressing the hope that we would end this war before we had dropped another 1 million tons of bombs on the Vietnamese. Well, that hope has been disappointed.
We could never get into the paper the very fact that we had reported the bombing tonnage. They didn't even go so far as to say, the Ellsbergs have this funny habit in every daily press conference of saying, here's how many bombs we dropped last week.
We've dropped another 200,000 tons of bombs on Indochina. That's 10 Hiroshimas, 1 Hiroshima a week.
They never even mentioned we'd said it, let alone reflect on the fact that it was happening. When I knew we were going to bomb Vietnam forever, that was like bombing the neighborhood. The people there were more than pictures for me, and they were more than numbers.
When we went to select our jury, we brought in an expert, actually a psychiatrist. He told us we were defending two young men, bright, high achievers, men with a future, who were willing to risk it all for the sake of not themselves or their own careerist interests, but for the sake of a principle. And the psychiatrist said to us, you don't want on this jury men of middle age, because these are people who in the course of their lives might possibly have sacrificed principle for the sake of career, for the sake of family, and they lived with that compromise, and they will have a lot of disdain, even contempt, for two men who did it for the sake of principle and took the risk.
In Los Angeles today, Daniel Ellsberg returned to the witness stand in the Pentagon Papers case And for the first time, the chief defendant spelled out how he changed from hawk to dove on the Vietnam